3 days after my husband's funeral, my son sat across the kitchen table from me and asked if I had thought about downsizing. He did not say it unkindly. That was the thing about Daniel. He never said the cruel things unkindly. He said them the way you'd mention rain in the forecast, as though he were simply reporting a fact I hadn't gotten around to noticing myself. It's a lot of house for one person, Mom. I looked past him toward the lake. Walter and I had lived in that house for 31 years. We had put in the dock ourselves the summer before Daniel was born. Walter had built the shelves beside the fireplace, badly, and spent the next 3 decades insisting they were perfectly level. His boots were still beside the back door. His coffee cup was still in the cabinet. His reading glasses were still on the table beside the chair where his heart had stopped 3 mornings before I buried him. And my son was already talking about selling the house. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. Daniel nodded slowly. It was the same nod he'd used when he was 7 and had already decided not to listen to me. "Just think about it, Mom. Brooke and I only want what's best for you." At the time, I believed him. Or perhaps I needed to. Grief makes you generous toward explanations you would normally examine more carefully. What I did not know was that within weeks, my daughter-in-law would begin collecting my mail before I could reach it. I did not know someone would attempt to access my bank account using a phone number I knew by heart. I did not know my signature would appear on a medical document I had never signed. And I certainly did not know that within 6 months my own son would stand in a courthouse and ask a judge to take away my legal right to make decisions for myself. He would say I was confused, forgetful, unable to manage my finances. He would present medical evidence to prove it. There was only one problem. I had never met the doctor who supposedly examined me. And the signature authorizing access to my medical records looked almost exactly like mine. Almost. Daniel had made another mistake too. A much larger one. He believed I was an ordinary 66-year-old widow with a paid-off lake house, a modest retirement account, and whatever remained of her husband's pension. He had believed that for most of his life. He had no idea who his mother actually was. And more importantly, he had no idea what I still controlled. My name is Ruth Calloway. Before I tell you what my son tried to do to me, you need to understand why he thought I would be easy to control. Because for almost 30 years, I had allowed him to underestimate me. I grew up the daughter of a machinist in a town so small it didn't get its first stoplight until I was in high school. My father believed there were 2 kinds of people in the world, people who understood how things worked, and people who paid the first group too much money to fix them. He intended for me to belong to the first group. I met Walter Calloway at a county fair when I was 19. I was selling raffle tickets for the volunteer fire department. He bought 3. Then he asked me what I wanted to do with my life. That sounds like nothing now. At 19, it was enough to make him memorable. Every other young man who approached that booth wanted to know whether I had a boyfriend. Walter wanted to know what I thought. We married 2 years later. We had nothing. We rented the upper floor of an old house that smelled permanently of mothballs. Walter worked days for a hardware supplier while I kept the books for 3 small businesses around town. One of them made industrial sealants in a barn behind the owner's house. His name was Alton Pierce. Alton was a widower in his 60s who had been making adhesives for 30 years. He knew more about the practical chemistry of bonding compounds than most people with degrees, but he had the organizational habits of a raccoon. His invoices were everywhere. His formulas were handwritten. His inventory records were often weeks behind. I was hired to fix the books. Instead, I started reading his notebooks. At first it was curiosity. Then I began noticing things. Adhesives that cured properly in January failed more often in July. Certain batches thickened faster than others. One formula showed a small but consistent difference in tensile strength depending on the temperature at which it was mixed. I asked Alton about it. He shrugged. That's just how that one behaves. I didn't like that answer. So I started studying. There was no internet then. If I wanted to understand something, I drove to the library and looked for it. I read trade journals, chemistry manuals, manufacturing bulletins. At night, after Walter came home, I spread Alton's formulas across our kitchen table. Walter would sit opposite me reading the newspaper while I covered yellow legal pads with calculations. One night he lowered the paper. You know Pierce isn't paying you to redesign his product. I know. Then why are you doing it? Because something's wrong. The product? The math. Walter stared at me for a moment. Then smiled. That's worse. He understood me. That was one of the reasons I married him. When Alton announced he was retiring, he planned to shut the business down. Walter and I asked whether he'd sell it to us. We had almost no money. No investors. No wealthy relatives. And Walter had never run anything larger than the inventory counter at his employer. Alton sat across a folding table from us in that drafty barn and looked at Walter. Why do you think you can run a chemical manufacturing business? Walter pointed at me. Don't ask me. I kicked him under the table. He ignored me. My wife has already rewritten half the formulas in your back office notebook. Alton looked at me. She has? Some of them, I said. Walter shook his head. Half. Alton slid the notebook across the table. All right. He leaned back. Tell me what I got wrong. I stood there in a coat that wasn't warm enough for October and spent almost an hour explaining curing temperatures, viscosity, and the inconsistency I'd found. Alton interrupted me twice. The first time to challenge my reasoning. The second time to ask me to repeat it. When I finished, he closed the notebook. How much can you two put down? That was how Calloway Bonding Systems began. Not in a boardroom. Not with investors. At a folding table in a barn. It took 9 years before we made what I would call a real profit. Before that, we nearly failed more times than Daniel would ever know. The worst was our 4th winter. A full truckload of raw resin arrived contaminated. We had already paid for it. The supplier blamed transportation. The transportation company blamed the supplier. Neither intended to reimburse us quickly enough to matter. We couldn't sell the material. We couldn't use it. And we couldn't afford another full shipment without borrowing money no bank was eager to lend us. Walter and I sat at our kitchen table until 2 a.m. with a legal pad between us. Eventually he put his head in his hands. We could lose everything by spring. I remember reaching across the table. Losing the company isn't the same as losing each other. He looked at me. Whatever happens, we still wake up married to the 2 idiots who bought a barn with money they didn't have. He laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed all night. Then his face became serious again. That's the only reason I'm not afraid. That week I found a paper in a trade journal describing an alternative curing agent. It was cheaper. More stable. And, according to the research, more forgiving of temperature variation. I tested it. The first batch failed. So did the second. The third bonded beautifully but cured too slowly. I changed the ratio. Then changed it again. The fifth version worked. Not merely well enough. Better. That formula, refined twice more over the next decade, became the backbone of the most profitable product line Calloway Bonding Systems ever produced. Nobody at the town Christmas parade knew that. Nobody at church knew. Most of the men who eventually shook Walter's hand and congratulated him on building such a successful company didn't know either. Walter always corrected them when I was nearby. Ruth built the chemistry, he'd say. I used to tell him it didn't matter. He disagreed. It'll matter someday. I wish I could tell you he was wrong. 22 years after we bought Alton Pierce's barn, Calloway Bonding Systems had become the second largest specialty adhesives manufacturer in 3 states. By then, private equity firms had started calling. One offered us enough money that Walter read the number twice before handing me the paper. We were tired. Daniel was growing up. Neither of us wanted to spend the rest of our lives worrying about production schedules and regulatory filings. So we made a decision. We sold operational control. We did not sell ownership. Through a trust established under my maiden name, Ruth Ainsley, we retained 61% of the voting shares. Walter insisted on my name. Everyone always assumes the wife married into the money, he said. I want it written down permanently that the money married into you. Only a handful of people knew the full structure. Walter. Me. Our attorney, Marjorie Fenwick. And a few people whose jobs required them to know. Professional managers ran the company. The town gradually assumed we'd sold everything. Walter and I never corrected them. We lived in the same lake house. Drove ordinary cars. Walter wore shirts until the collars frayed. I once spent 3 weeks comparing prices before replacing a washing machine we could have bought 1,000 times over without noticing the cost. We gave money away quietly through the trust. Scholarships. Hospital equipment. A burn unit 2 towns over. Nobody needed our names on a wall. And Daniel grew up believing his parents were comfortable but unremarkable. A retired factory couple. A paid-off house. A pension. Savings. That was more or less the story. Just not the whole one. I thought keeping the money from Daniel would make him independent. I did not want him walking through life calculating what he might someday inherit. When he eventually applied for a job at Calloway Bonding Systems, I did nothing to help him. He was hired on his own. Promoted on his own. Over 11 years he became director of regional operations. He never knew his mother controlled the majority voting interest in the company whose name appeared on his paycheck. At the time, I considered that good parenting. Later, I would question it. Because while I had hidden the money from my son, I had also hidden the cost of creating it. Daniel saw comfort. He never saw the nights Walter and I wondered whether payroll would clear. He saw a paid-off house. He never saw the years we postponed repairing the roof. He saw 2 retired parents living modestly. He never understood what modesty meant when it was a choice rather than a limitation. A person who does not understand what something costs can eventually begin to believe it cost nothing at all. And sometimes that includes the people who built it. Walter died in March. His heart simply stopped one morning while he was reading the newspaper in his chair beside the window. His glasses were still on. His coffee was still warm. I will not describe that morning beyond that. Some griefs become smaller when you narrate them. Others do not. I buried the only man who had ever completely known me. 3 days later, Daniel mentioned downsizing. At the funeral reception, Brooke took it further. Brooke was Daniel's wife of 9 years. Sharp. Ambitious. Beautiful in a controlled sort of way. She worked in commercial real estate development and had the unusual ability to enter a room and determine within 30 seconds who mattered in it. "It's a lot of upkeep for one person, Ruth," she said, standing in my kitchen with a plate of food she had barely touched. "4 bedrooms. All those stairs. Have you thought about what happens if you fall? I've climbed those stairs every day for 31 years. Of course." She smiled. "Nobody's saying you need to decide anything now." It was the kind of sentence people use after they've already made the decision for you. After everyone left, my granddaughter Sophie stayed behind. She was 19, home from her first year of college. She helped me wrap casseroles and stack folding chairs. Eventually she came and stood beside me at the kitchen sink. "Are you going to be okay here alone?" I looked toward Walter's chair. "I've lived beside this water longer than I've lived anywhere else. Leaving now would feel like agreeing to lose 2 things instead of 1. Sophie squeezed my hand. "Then don't." I looked at her. "I don't think you should have to leave anything you don't want to leave, Grandma." It was the simplest thing anyone had said to me all week. And perhaps the kindest. I wish I could tell you I became suspicious immediately. I didn't. That matters. Because people sometimes tell stories like mine as though the victim should have recognized everything from the beginning. Real life rarely works that way. The first suspicious thing usually looks innocent. So does the second. It's only when you reach the 5th or 6th that you look backward and realize the first one wasn't innocent at all. Grief made me vulnerable. It also made me lonely. I gave Daniel a key to the lake house. Not because I needed help. Because I wanted a reason for him to come by. When Brooke offered to manage my mail for a while, I agreed. She said there would be insurance notices, probate correspondence and bills I shouldn't have to think about while I was grieving. It sounded thoughtful. So I let her. A credit card statement went missing. Then an appointment reminder. Then another envelope I was almost certain should have arrived. I blamed myself. Walter had been dead barely a month. People forget things when they grieve. Then Sophie asked me a question. "Grandma, did you know Mom's been getting your mail before you do?" We were sitting on the porch. "What do you mean?" "I saw her car at your mailbox Tuesday morning. She's helping me with it." "Before it reaches you?" I looked at Sophie. "Why are you asking?" She shrugged, but I could see she wasn't satisfied. "I saw her Thursday too. Maybe she was checking on me." "Maybe." Sophie didn't argue. That was one thing I liked about her. She knew how to leave a fact on the table without insisting you interpret it the way she did. A week later, my neighbor Priscilla Todd stopped me outside the post office. Priscilla knew everything happening within 5 miles of town, though she would have denied being a gossip until her dying breath. "Saw Brooke over at County Records the other morning," she said. "Brooke?" "Figured it was one of her development projects. Funny, though. Thought most of her work was in the other county." County records. Deeds. Liens. Probate filings. On its own, it meant nothing. But I had spent decades reading financial statements. 1 strange number means nothing. 2 strange numbers deserve a note. 3 deserve investigation. That afternoon I took out a notebook. I wrote, "Brooke collecting mail, Sophie." Underneath, County records, Priscilla. I added the dates as best I could remember. I didn't know why. Not yet. Then my bank called. It was a Tuesday morning in May. Mrs. Calloway, we're calling to verify a transfer request. What transfer? The representative named an amount. It wasn't enormous compared with what the Ainsley Trust held. But Daniel didn't know about the trust. This was the household account Walter and I had used for years. The account Daniel and Brooke believed represented most of what I had available. I didn't request that. The representative's voice became more careful. Ma'am, an online banking profile was recently created for this account. I don't bank online. There was a pause. Are you certain? I'm 66, not senile. Yes, I'm certain. She apologized. Then explained that the new profile had been verified using personal information and a phone number associated with the account. What number? She read the final 4 digits. 4 1 7 3. I didn't have to check. I knew that number by heart. I'd called it on birthdays. Christmas mornings. The night Sophie was born. It belonged to Daniel. I sat at my kitchen table after the call ended. The lake outside was perfectly still. I expected anger. Instead, I felt something colder. Something familiar. The feeling I'd had 40 years earlier when I first noticed Alton Pierce's summer batches failed at a different rate from his winter ones. A number didn't add up. And I had learned a long time ago that the moment you notice a number doesn't add up is not the moment to announce it. It's the moment to start writing everything down. I opened the notebook. Under Brooke and County records, I wrote. Unauthorized bank access. Verification number, Daniel. For the first time, the list frightened me. The following morning I called the bank back. I froze all online access. Requested the audit trail in writing. Asked them to preserve the date, time, and verification information. I gave no explanation beyond saying I had not authorized the login. Then I made a phone call I had not expected to make so soon after Walter died. Marjorie? Ruth? It's been too long. It has. Her voice softened. How are you holding up? I've had better years. I'm sorry about Walter. I know. There was a silence only old friends can tolerate. Then I said. Marjorie, I need you to pull the current status of the Ainsley Trust. Her tone changed immediately. Why? And I need you to tell me whether anyone has been asking questions about me. Another pause. What happened? I told her. Brooke. The mail. County records. The bank. Daniel's phone number. Marjorie listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said nothing for several seconds. Then, Ruth, 3 weeks ago an attorney called me. I sat straighter. He asked generalized questions about family trusts and beneficiary competency challenges. What kind of questions? What happens when a controlling beneficiary becomes mentally incapacitated? How voting rights are exercised under guardianship. Whether a court-appointed guardian can exercise authority on behalf of a beneficiary. My fingers tightened around the receiver. Did you tell him anything? Nothing specific. He claimed he was researching a matter for a colleague. Who was he? Craig Willoughby. The name meant nothing to me. Apparently my silence told Marjorie that. He's Brooke's cousin. My hand stopped over the notebook. He handles elder law and guardianship petitions. I looked out at the lake. A heron stood motionless near the end of the dock. Marjorie. Yes? I think my son is trying to have me declared incompetent. She did not tell me I was imagining things. She did not tell me Daniel loved me. She did not tell me families sometimes become overprotective after a death. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. Instead, she said, I think we need to find out exactly what he's building before he finishes it. That was the moment the problem changed shape. Until then, I thought Daniel wanted the house. Maybe access to my bank account. Perhaps he and Brooke believed I needed supervision and had crossed a line trying to provide it. But competency was different. A guardianship order could give another person control over where I lived. What I spent. What contracts I signed. Potentially how my financial interests were managed. And if Craig Willoughby had specifically asked about voting rights held through a trust, then someone knew there might be more to investigate than the lake house. How much they knew, I couldn't tell. Marjorie gave me one instruction. Do not confront Daniel. I wasn't planning to. Good. Why? Because right now we know very little. If you tell him what we know, he changes tactics. I'd spent 40 years in business. I understood immediately. The person who reacts first often reveals the most. So I did something that felt unnatural for a mother. I watched my son. I let Brooke continue believing she was collecting my important mail. She wasn't. Marjorie helped me redirect anything sensitive to a private post office box. I let Daniel believe his key still worked. Then I had the locks changed. I said nothing. And I let both of them continue believing I remained exactly the woman they thought I was. Grieving. Slightly forgetful. Financially ordinary. Easy. There was one close call. A Saturday afternoon in late May, I heard Daniel rattling the front door. The old key no longer fit. I reached him before he could become too suspicious. Mom? Did you change the lock? It started sticking. I opened the door. Locksmith said it was easier to replace. He looked at the key in his hand. You could have told me. I forgot. The word came out before I thought about it. Forgot. For a fraction of a second, something changed in Daniel's face. Not concern. Recognition. As if I'd just given him a piece of evidence. I saw it. And immediately wished I hadn't said it. I smiled. I suppose that's what happens when you get old. He smiled back. That's why we worry. That sentence stayed with me after he left. I had meant the forgetfulness as camouflage. Daniel had received it as confirmation. That was when I understood how dangerous ordinary mistakes could become once someone had decided to interpret them as symptoms. A few days later, Marjorie asked me to come to her office to sign a routine trust renewal. Her office was 2 towns over in a converted Victorian with a brass nameplate so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking. I was sitting in the waiting room when a man in his 60s entered. Well-cut suit. Silver hair. He looked at me and stopped. Mrs. Calloway? I recognized him a second later. Foster Lang. He sat on the board of Calloway Bonding Systems. I didn't expect to see you here, he said. It's been years. It has. He shook my hand. I remember you from the plant opening. It's an honor. That's very kind. We exchanged a few pleasantries. Then he left. I thought little of it. 3 days later Daniel came for dinner. Halfway through the meal he said, "Funny thing happened at work." "What?" "Foster Lang asked about you." I kept eating. "Did he?" "Said he ran into you at some lawyer's office." "Marjorie's." "He asked if you were the Ruth Calloway who used to come around the old plant." Daniel laughed. "I told him he must have you confused with somebody else. You haven't been involved there in 20 years. I looked at my son. He genuinely did not know. "Maybe he remembered your father," I said. "Probably." He changed the subject. I did not. Not internally. The walls around the secret were thinner than I had realized. And time might not be entirely on my side. The next escalation came in June. Sophie arrived at my house on a Thursday evening. She was holding her phone. Her face told me something was wrong before she spoke. "Grandma, I need to show you something." "What happened?" "I was doing laundry at home. Mom's laptop was open on the counter." She looked embarrassed. "I wasn't snooping." "I know." I reached for a dish towel and saw an email. She opened a note she'd typed on her phone. The subject line said, "Draft Evaluation, R. Calloway." My stomach tightened. "Who sent it?" "Craig Willoughby." I said nothing. Sophie looked at me. "You know who he is?" "Keep going." I couldn't read the whole thing. Mom came back. "What did you see?" Sophie read from her notes. Cognitive decline. A pause. Diminished capacity. Another. Recommend proceeding with formal petition within 90 days. The kitchen seemed very quiet. "Grandma." She looked frightened now. "Is something wrong with you?" That question hurt in a way Daniel's behavior had not. Not because Sophie believed it. Because someone had made her afraid it might be true. I reached across the table. "No." "Are you sure?" "Completely." "Then why would Mom have?" "I don't know everything yet." That was true. "But I think your parents are trying to convince a court there is." Sophie's face changed. "Why would they do that?" I almost told her. "The company. The trust. The 61%. But once a secret that large is spoken, it cannot be taken back." And Sophie was 19. She was still living partly under her parents' roof. I would not make her responsible for protecting information she had never asked to know. "I don't know yet," I said. It was only partly a lie. I knew what they appeared to be doing. I still didn't know exactly why. That night I couldn't sleep. Something about the phrase draft evaluation bothered me. An attorney could make allegations. Family members could claim forgetfulness. But a competency case needed more than opinions. If Craig Willoughby was already discussing an evaluation, there had to be a medical foundation somewhere. And I had not been evaluated. The following morning I called Dr. Okafor. He had been my internist for 11 years. His office manager, Denise, answered. "Denise, has anyone requested my medical records recently?" Keyboard noise. "Actually, yes." My grip tightened around the phone. "When?" "May." "Who authorized it?" Another pause. "It says you did." "No." Silence. "I didn't." Denise's voice became careful. "We have a signed release." "Send it to me." "Mrs. Calloway, I." "Please." She hesitated. I'll pull the original. The email arrived that afternoon. I printed the attachment. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my own name. Ruth Calloway. At a glance, it looked right. Whoever had done it had practiced. The proportions were close. The C resembled mine. The spacing was almost correct. But I had signed thousands of documents. Contracts. Mortgage papers. Shareholder agreements. Trust amendments. I knew my own hand. Mine curved inward. This one curved out. And I always put a tiny hook at the end of the final H. This signature didn't. Someone had forged my name. Not to take money. To obtain my private medical records. I photographed the document. Sent it to Marjorie. She called 20 minutes later. Ruth. I know. No. Listen carefully. Her voice was harder than usual. If this holds up under handwriting analysis, we're no longer discussing an overprotective family or a disagreement about your living arrangements. What are we discussing? Potential forgery used to obtain private medical information in preparation for a fraudulent guardianship petition. I looked at the signature again. Criminal? Potentially, yes. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then I asked. What do? We document it. And Daniel? Nothing. Nothing? Not yet. Why? Because every additional step they take may become evidence. Marjorie paused. Let them believe they're winning, Ruth. Another pause. Let them get greedy. That was when I stopped thinking of what was happening as a family disagreement. But emotionally, I was not there yet. That distinction matters. Intellectually, I could look at a forged signature and understand exactly what it meant. Emotionally, Daniel was still my son. The boy who had once fallen asleep against my shoulder during thunderstorms. The teenager Walter taught to drive in the church parking lot. The young man who cried when Sophie was born. Part of me kept searching for an explanation that would allow both versions of Daniel to exist. Maybe Brooke was driving this. Maybe Willoughby had convinced him it was normal. Maybe Daniel genuinely thought I was deteriorating. Maybe he had panicked after Walter died. People can build extraordinary excuses for those they love. I built several. Daniel unknowingly destroyed them one by one. That summer his visits became more frequent. Every conversation contained questions. How are you sleeping? Did you remember your doctor's appointment? Are you still driving at night? Have you misplaced anything lately? On the surface, loving questions. Now I heard something beneath them. Data collection. One Sunday in July he reached across the dinner table. Mom, Brooke and I really think it's time we talk seriously about your living situation. Brooke sat opposite me. We worry about you. I appreciate that. Daniel seemed relieved. Then I continued. But I'm staying. Brooke smiled. Of course. Nobody's pushing you. They were pushing me into everything. I simply let them believe I hadn't noticed the shove. What I did not know then was that Brooke had reasons of her own to be desperate. I learned the details much later. She had invested heavily in a boutique townhouse development on the edge of town. The project was supposed to turn around in 18 months. Instead, a contractor dispute had eaten into the margin. Permitting delays stretched the timeline. Financing costs climbed. By the summer after Walter died, Brooke and Daniel were under considerably more financial pressure than either admitted publicly. I say this because I promised myself I would tell this story honestly. Brooke did not wake up one morning and decide to become cruel. She was frightened. But frightened people are not automatically innocent people. Fear can make a person ask for help. It can also make a person decide somebody else's property is an unused resource. Brooke chose the second path. In August, Daniel arrived alone. He carried a folder. Just precautionary stuff. He put it in front of me. Inside were documents appointing him healthcare proxy and financial power of attorney. I read the first page. Then closed the folder. I already have these. He frowned. What? Those arrangements were made years ago. With who? Marjorie. His expression changed. Marjorie Fenwick? Yes. Mom, she's practically a stranger. I looked at him. She's been our family's attorney for 35 years. I'm your son. There it was. Not concern. Entitlement. Family should handle family matters, he said. I'm comfortable with the arrangements I have. His jaw tightened. For 1 second, the patient expression disappeared. Then it returned. Just think about it. I will. I didn't. There was another thing Daniel didn't know. Marjorie knew me better than he did. She knew about the years in the barn. The trust. The private equity deal. She had sat with me after Walter died and cried real tears. Daniel had not cried once in front of me. That didn't make him heartless. People grieve differently. But I had begun to notice that every conversation Daniel had with me since the funeral involved something he wanted me to change. My house. My mail. My banking. My legal documents. At some point, concern that always requires the other person to surrender control stops looking like concern. 3 weeks later, Sophie called at 11 at night. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. Grandma, they had a huge fight. Who? Mom and Dad. I sat upright. What happened? I don't know. Dad went into the office and called somebody afterward. She struggled to breathe. I heard him say something. What? If she won't sign it voluntarily. She stopped. What did he say, sweetheart? Her voice dropped. He said, we'll just have to go the other way. The doctor already gave us enough to work with. For the first time since this began, I felt real fear. Not for my money. Not for the company. For myself. Because whoever this doctor was, Daniel apparently believed he already had what he needed. Sophie. Yes? Pack a bag. What? Come stay with me tonight. She arrived 25 minutes later. We sat at my kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee neither of us needed. And that was when I finally told my granddaughter the truth. All of it. I told her about Alton's barn. The contaminated resin. The formula. The private equity deal. The trust. When I told her the percentage, she stopped me. Wait. What? 61? Yes. You own 61% of Calloway Bonding Systems? Technically the trust does. And you control the trust? Yes. She stared at me. Dad works there. I know. Does Dad know? No. Sophie leaned back. For almost a minute she said nothing. Then, "Oh my God." I almost smiled. It was the first normal reaction I'd heard in months. "So Dad thinks you're an ordinary retired widow. But you're still an ordinary retired widow, Grandma. I also happen to control 61% of the voting shares." She stood and walked toward the window. Then turned around. "Why didn't you tell him?" That question hurt more than I expected. "Your grandfather, and I thought growing up without knowing about the money would make him independent." "Did it?" I looked down at my coffee. "I don't know." Then Sophie asked, "Does he know now?" "No." "Don't tell him." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because he's already trying to control you when he thinks you don't have much." She looked toward Walter's empty chair. "What happens when he realizes how much there actually is?" I had spent 40 years making business decisions. My 19-year-old granddaughter had just seen the risk faster than I had. Marjorie agreed. "Daniel knows enough to believe you have assets worth controlling," she said. "He does not need to know the extent." "But what if telling him stops this?" "Do you believe it would?" That was the question I couldn't answer. And because I couldn't, I said nothing. Instead, Marjorie hired a handwriting analyst. The conclusion was exactly what I expected. The signature on the medical release was not mine. Then Denise found something worse. A second records request. This one from April. Earlier than the first. Whoever had been building the case against me had started far sooner than we'd realized. Possibly within weeks of Walter's funeral. I sat in Marjorie's office while she laid out the dates. March, Walter died. 3 days later, Daniel raised downsizing. April, first medical records request. May, bank access. May, second medical records request. June, draft competency evaluation. August, power of attorney. It wasn't a collection of impulsive decisions. It was architecture. A plan. That realization changed something in me. I stopped asking whether Daniel intended to hurt me. Intent was becoming irrelevant. Actions were enough. Sophie continued visiting her parents. I never asked her to spy. I want that understood. She was 19, and whatever Daniel and Brooke had done, they were still her parents. I refused to make her choose. Brooke tried to make the choice for her. One evening Sophie called. "Mom says I'm spending too much time with you." What exactly did she say? That it isn't healthy for someone my age to be so wrapped up in her grandmother's problems. I almost laughed. What else? She thinks I should focus on school and let the adults sort this out. How do you feel about that? I think she doesn't want me seeing something. So did I. But I said, "You don't owe me information about your parents." I know. And I'm never going to ask you to choose. I know that too. She paused. But I'm not going anywhere, Grandma. There was Walter's stubbornness in her voice. It steadied me. Later, Marjorie and I realized Brooke had tried to distance Sophie only days after Sophie saw the Willoughby email. Brooke suspected her daughter knew something. For the first time, they were becoming nervous. That was useful. Nervous people make mistakes. Marjorie began building a formal evidence file. My bank preserved the audit trail from the unauthorized login. The phone number was documented. Dr. Okafor's office preserved the forged authorization. The handwriting analyst prepared a report. And Marjorie called someone I had not spoken to in years. Hollis Bramwell. Hollis was 74. He had been plant operations manager at Calloway Bonding for the first 18 years. He had seen the company when the loading dock was 2 plywood boards over mud. He had watched me reformulate the resin mixture. When Marjorie asked whether he remembered who developed the early formulas, he apparently laughed. Remember? Then, Ruth Calloway built that adhesive formula at her kitchen table. Anybody who says otherwise wasn't there. Hollis agreed to testify if we ever needed him. I hoped we wouldn't. I was still hoping for things I should have stopped hoping for. Then one piece of our case nearly disappeared. Denise called Marjorie's office in distress. She had spoken with the medical practice's attorney. He warned that voluntarily providing a sworn statement about patient records might expose her personally. She wanted to withdraw. For 3 days, we believed we'd lost the person who could explain exactly how the forged authorization entered Dr. Okafor's system. I remember sitting in Marjorie's office. Without Denise? We still have the document. But not the chain. Not cleanly. What do? We do it properly. Marjorie worked with the practice's attorney. A formal subpoena was issued. That protected Denise. And when she went back through the archived system to prepare the response, she found something none of us expected. The earlier April request. She also found digital information attached to the submissions. Eventually, through proper legal process, that information was traced to an internet connection at Daniel and Brooke's home. Marjorie cautioned me immediately. That doesn't prove who was sitting at the computer. I understand. A household IP can be used by multiple people. I understand. But it proves something. What? That this didn't originate from some stranger. I didn't sleep much that night. Then I made a mistake. Or perhaps I made the last mistake I needed to make before I finally understood my son. Despite everything, I decided to give Daniel one chance. I called him. Come to the house. Is everything okay? I need to talk to you. About what? Come alone. He arrived an hour later. We sat in the living room where Walter used to read the paper. I had planned to tell him everything. Instead, looking at him, I changed my mind. I told him only part. I know about the bank access. His face changed. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Mom. I also know somebody obtained my medical records using a signature that isn't mine. He went pale. That was enough. I didn't mention the trust. Didn't mention 61%. Didn't mention Hollis. Didn't mention the handwriting report. I simply watched him. Daniel, if this is about money, ask me. He stared at me. Ask you what? For help. His expression hardened. You think this is about money? I think you should tell me what it's about. We're worried about you. Then why forge my signature? I didn't forge anything. Did Brooke? No. Craig? I don't know what you're talking about. It was too quick. Not confusion. Denial. I felt something inside me settle. Stop whatever you're doing. Daniel stood. You have no idea what you're talking about. Then stopping should be easy. He looked at me for a long moment. Then said. You've been acting strange since Dad died. There it was. Strange how? Suspicious. Secretive. Forgetful. Forgetful? You changed the locks and forgot to tell me. I remembered the word I'd used months earlier. He had kept it. Catalogued it. I almost admired the thoroughness. Almost. Anything else? You miss appointments. Which appointments? He hesitated. Brooke keeps track. Of course she does. His jaw tightened. Mom, this is exactly what I'm talking about. What? You're turning everything into an accusation. I looked at my son and understood that he had come prepared to reinterpret resistance itself as evidence of decline. That frightened me more than shouting would have. I stood. You should go. Mom. Go. He left without saying goodbye. I did not tell him about the trust. And after that conversation, I knew Sophie had been right. 2 days later Sophie called. Mom asked me what you told Dad. What did you say? Nothing. Sophie. I didn't lie. I said you and Dad should talk to each other. I smiled despite myself. That's technically true. Grandma, they're scared. How do you know? They're fighting constantly. About what? Money, mostly. That was the first time Sophie said it plainly. She told me pieces. The townhouse project. Contractor problems. Loans. Brooke's fear that the development might fail publicly. Suddenly the pressure around my house made more sense. Not morally. Practically. Brooke wasn't merely concerned about an old widow living alone. She was looking at assets. And Daniel, whatever story he'd told himself, had begun looking too. In September, Sophie called again. This time she whispered. Grandma. What happened? I found it. What? The petition. I stood. What petition? The one to have you declared incompetent. She had gone home to pick up clothes. On the kitchen counter was a folder bearing Craig Willoughby's letterhead. Inside was a completed guardianship petition. Notarized. Ready. On the family calendar, Monday the 14th was circled. They're filing Monday. My hand tightened around the phone. Don't touch anything. I already put it back. Good. Grandma, what are you going to do? I don't know yet. I called Marjorie. She listened. Then said something that sounded insane. Let them file. What? Let them file. Marjorie. Right now, we have evidence of preparation. If they knowingly submit false material to a court, they commit to their version of events on the record. You're asking me to let my son tell a judge I'm incompetent. I'm asking you to let him put his claims where they can be examined. I walked toward Walter's chair. What if the judge believes him? Then we fight. What if something goes wrong? Then we fight harder. I said nothing. Marjorie's voice softened. Ruth, people succeed with schemes like this because the person they're targeting becomes frightened enough to surrender before anyone looks closely. I looked out at the dock Walter and I had built. You're not going to surrender. No. Then let him file. Those were the hardest 6 days of the entire ordeal. I knew what was coming. Every time a car slowed near the house, I looked toward the window. Monday passed. Nothing. Tuesday. Nothing. For one foolish moment, I wondered whether Daniel had changed his mind. Wednesday afternoon, a young man walked up my porch carrying an envelope. Mrs. Calloway? Yes. He looked almost apologetic. I'm sorry. I have legal documents for you. He handed them over. My son's name. My name. A petition asking the state to declare me legally incapacitated. I sat on the porch after he left. I read every page. Significantly impaired capacity. Financial confusion. Memory lapses. Failure to manage personal affairs. Then I reached the medical evaluation. Dr. Sandra Wren. According to the document, she had assessed me for cognitive impairment. I read it twice. I had never met Sandra Wren. Never spoken to her. Never entered her office. Yet there it was. A clinical evaluation of a woman she had never examined. That was the moment I stopped being afraid. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Now the lie had a name. A signature. A filing date. A case number. And a courtroom. I called Marjorie. It arrived. How do you feel? I looked at Daniel's signature at the bottom of the petition. Ready. 2 days later Brooke came to my house alone. No call. No warning. She stood on my porch wearing a coat that cost more than Walter used to spend on clothes in a year. You can still stop this. I didn't file it. You know what I mean. Her usual composure was gone. If this goes forward, Daniel could lose his job. Then Daniel should have considered that. We could lose everything. That sentence caught my attention. Everything. Not me. Not the family. Everything. What exactly are you afraid of losing, Brooke? Her expression shifted. This isn't about me. Isn't it? She looked away. The development project isn't going well, is it? Her eyes returned to mine. Who told you? That was answer enough. How much trouble are you in? That's none of your business. You've been collecting my mail. Silence. You've been looking at county records. Her face changed. You tried to take control of my finances. I never. My son used his phone number to access my bank account. Daniel was trying to help you. Without telling me? She stepped closer. You have more than you need. There it was. I felt strangely calm. Who gets to decide what I need? You could help your son. He never asked. You knew he was struggling. No. I knew he wanted things. He's your child. He's 38. Brooke stared at me. Then she made the mistake I would remember longer than almost anything else she said. If you take this into court, don't expect Sophie to forgive you for sending her father to prison. For a moment, she found the one place in me still soft enough to hurt. Then I thought of Sophie at my kitchen table. I'm not sending anyone anywhere. Ruth. Daniel filed the petition. She went silent. Someone forged my signature. Her face paled. Someone fabricated an evaluation. I stepped back and opened the door wider. If Sophie ever has to decide who caused what happens next, she's intelligent enough to work it out. Brooke had no answer. She turned and walked to her car. I watched the dust settle behind her. And I understood that whatever confidence she'd had when this began was gone. The night before the hearing, my own confidence cracked too. I sat at the kitchen table. Not thinking about the trust. Not the forged signature. Not Sandra Wren. I thought about Daniel at 7 years old. A bowl of cereal. Math homework. Mom, check this. I remembered how certain I'd been that I was raising a good man. I called Hollis. Not because I needed evidence. Because I needed someone who had known Walter. He listened for nearly an hour. Then said, "You didn't forge that signature, Ruth." I said nothing. "You didn't invent that doctor." Silence. "You didn't file that petition." I raised him. Yes. Doesn't that make some part of this mine? It makes his pain partly yours because you're his mother. Hollis paused. It doesn't make his choices yours. I looked at Walter's chair. A person is responsible for the wrong they actually do, Hollis said. Not every wrong somebody they love does around them. I cried after we hung up. Then I went upstairs. In the morning, I put on my gray coat. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Old wood paneling. Fluorescent lights. A clock loud enough to hear between sentences. Daniel arrived with Brooke and a younger attorney from Craig Willoughby's firm. Craig himself was absent. Marjorie noticed. Interesting. What? He doesn't want his fingerprints any closer to this than they already are. I sat down. Daniel looked at me once. Then away. Judge Alvarez entered. Everyone stood. She summarized the petition. Daniel Calloway sought to have his mother, Ruth Calloway, declared incapacitated and requested appointment as guardian with authority over her financial and healthcare decisions. Hearing it aloud was different from reading it. My son wanted legal control of my life. Judge Alvarez looked toward Daniel's attorney. Your petition references a competency evaluation by Dr. Sandra Wren. Yes, Your Honor. Is Dr. Wren present? No, Your Honor. Unfortunately, she was unable to attend. The judge's expression didn't change. Then her paper will need to do considerably more work than I normally ask paper to do before I strip a woman of her legal autonomy. Marjorie stood. Your Honor, before the court considers Dr. Wren's conclusions, we have significant concerns about the authenticity of the authorization through which Mrs. Calloway's medical records were obtained. Then she put my signatures into evidence. 11 authentic samples. 30 years. Beside them, the forged release. The handwriting analyst's report followed. Daniel's attorney objected. Judge Alvarez read the analysis herself. Then came Denise's statement. The records requests. The dates. The digital trail. Daniel's attorney stood. Even accepting certain irregularities in the authorization process, my client's concern for his mother's well-being was genuine. Judge Alvarez looked at him. I'll be interested to hear the evidence supporting that concern. He called Brooke. Brooke began confidently. She described my forgetfulness. A repeated story. A missed appointment. General confusion after Walter's death. Marjorie listened. Then stood for cross-examination. You mentioned an appointment Mrs. Calloway missed in June. Yes. With whom? Brooke hesitated. Dr. Wren. Did Mrs. Calloway attend any appointment with Dr. Wren? My understanding is that she did. Your understanding? Yes. Were you there? No. Who told you she attended? Brooke looked toward Daniel. Less than a second. Everyone saw it. Marjorie did too. Mrs. Calloway never attended Dr. Wren's office. Brooke stared at her. Marjorie produced the intake records. No Ruth Calloway. No appointment. No visit. Nothing. Brooke's composure cracked. Daniel's attorney stood. Your Honor. Judge Alvarez raised a hand. Sit down. He did. For the first time, I saw fear on Daniel's face. Then Marjorie called Hollis. Daniel frowned when he saw him. He knew Hollis. Everyone at Calloway Bonding knew Hollis. He had been part of company history long before Daniel arrived. Hollis took the oath. Marjorie asked about my mental abilities. He talked about production budgets, formula calculations, contracts. Then she asked, Mr. Bramwell, during your time at Calloway Bonding Systems, who developed the company's early high-strength bonding formula? Ruth. Daniel's head lifted. Mrs. Calloway? Yes, ma'am. Hollis looked at me. She rebuilt the formula at her kitchen table after contaminated resin nearly put us under. Daniel stared. Marjorie continued. Was Walter Calloway responsible for the technical formulation? Hollis smiled. Walter would have been the first man to tell you he couldn't formulate glue if his life depended on it. A few quiet laughs. Ruth handled chemistry. Walter handled sales. That's how it worked. Daniel leaned toward his attorney. Whispered. His attorney looked at him. Then at me. Something had changed. For the first time, Daniel was realizing that the story he knew about his parents might not be the whole story. Marjorie wasn't finished. In your experience, has Mrs. Calloway demonstrated an inability to understand financial matters? Hollis smiled. If Ruth Calloway is financially incompetent, Your Honor, I'd like to know what that makes the rest of us. The gallery laughed softly. Judge Alvarez raised her hand. But I saw the corner of her mouth move. Daniel's attorney tried one final pivot. Whatever irregularities may have occurred in obtaining records, Dr. Wren's clinical conclusions. There were no clinical conclusions, Marjorie said. Silence. Daniel's attorney turned. What? We subpoenaed Dr. Wren's complete intake log. Marjorie handed the records to the clerk. Mrs. Calloway never attended her office. Judge Alvarez read. The courtroom became very quiet. Then on what basis was this evaluation written? Nobody answered. The clock ticked. Judge Alvarez looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Calloway. Daniel swallowed. Did your mother ever attend an evaluation with Dr. Wren? His attorney stood. My client requests a recess. Judge Alvarez looked at him. Counsel, you may confer with your client in a moment. Then she looked back at Daniel. I am asking whether the factual foundation of a petition bearing your signature actually occurred. Daniel said nothing. His attorney whispered. Do not answer. Judge Alvarez's expression hardened. Then I strongly suggest you confer. She looked down at the papers. Because what has been presented this morning suggests that this court may have received a petition supported by a forged medical authorization and a fabricated clinical evaluation. She paused. If that is correct, this is no longer simply a guardianship matter. Daniel closed his eyes. I am obligated to refer it for investigation. We recessed. I walked into the hallway. Mom. I kept walking. Mom, please. I stopped. Daniel looked genuinely afraid. Willoughby said this was standard. I stared at him. He said these evaluations were normal in cases like this. I didn't know he'd. You knew I never met Dr. Wren. Daniel stopped. Whatever Craig had told him could not rescue him from that. You knew that, I repeated. Brooke stood several feet away, already speaking urgently into her phone. Daniel lowered his voice. I was trying to protect you. No. Mom. You were trying to control me. That's not fair. Neither was forging my signature. I didn't forge it. Then tell the investigators who did. His face tightened. I felt no triumph. Only exhaustion. Then Marjorie appeared. Ruth. What? The judge wants clarification regarding the financial interests that would have fallen under a guardianship order. Daniel looked confused. What financial interests? Marjorie looked at me. For months, we had agreed not to tell him. Now the reason for secrecy was gone. I looked at my son. Do you know the name Ruth Ainsley? He frowned. No. You should. Why? Ainsley was my name before I married your father. He stared at me. Marjorie spoke carefully. The Ruth Ainsley Trust holds a controlling voting interest in Calloway Bonding Systems. Daniel's face emptied. What? I said nothing. Calloway Bonding? Yes. No. Yes. You sold it. We sold operational control. I paused. Not ownership. His mouth opened. How much? I looked at him. 61%. For several seconds my son did not move. 61%. The company? Yes. You. He couldn't finish. And then I watched the arithmetic happen. The mother he had described as financially confused controlled the largest voting block in the company where he had spent 11 years trying to climb the management ladder. The widow whose modest bank account he'd attempted to access was not sitting on the small estate he believed existed. The lake house he'd wanted me to leave was not the most valuable thing I owned. Not even close. And if his guardianship petition had succeeded, he might have gained authority over interests worth vastly more than he had understood when he began. His face changed again. Why didn't you tell me? There were 100 possible answers. I chose the simplest. Your father, and I wanted to know who you would become without it. Daniel flinched. And now? I looked at him. Now I know. The petition did not survive the afternoon. Daniel's attorney recommended withdrawing it. The judge still referred the underlying evidence for investigation. Craig Willoughby suddenly became very difficult for Daniel to reach. That did not surprise Marjorie. The consequences did not arrive dramatically. Real consequences rarely do. They arrived in letters. Interviews. Subpoenas. Meetings. Phone calls. Daniel was placed on administrative leave by Calloway Bonding Systems. I did not order it. Foster Lane called me. Ruth, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Did Daniel know about your ownership? No. There was a long silence. Good God. He does now. What do you want us to do? That question mattered. For the first time in decades, I could have used the power Walter and I had kept hidden. I could have demanded Daniel be fired. I could have insisted the board punish him. I could have made one phone call and ensured everyone understood exactly whose side they were expected to take. Instead I said, Do whatever you'd do if his last name weren't Calloway. Foster was silent. That's all? That's all. The board terminated him within the month. Not because I demanded it. Because an employee involved in a fraud investigation concerning the company's controlling shareholder could not reasonably remain director of regional operations. Daniel had spent years believing the family name should have helped him more. Now, for the first time, it could not help him at all. Craig Willoughby's problems became larger than mine. Investigators found other cases. Other questionable competency evaluations. Other elderly clients whose relatives had sought control of property or businesses. 6 months later, Craig lost his license to practice law in the state. One of those other cases involved a woman named Corinne. Her nephew had nearly gained control of the hardware business her late husband had left her. The method was disturbingly familiar. Concerns about memory. A convenient evaluation. Pressure to surrender authority. Corinne contacted Marjorie's office after the disciplinary proceedings became public. We spoke on the phone for almost 2 hours. Two women who had never met comparing notes on a form of betrayal neither had expected to experience. Strangely, that conversation helped me. There is relief in being understood by someone who does not need the story translated into softer language. Daniel was charged in connection with the forged medical authorization and the unauthorized bank access. The evidence regarding exactly who physically created every document was more complicated than the simple version people around town preferred to tell. But Daniel had signed and advanced the petition. He had participated. Eventually he cooperated. He had no prior criminal record. And at Marjorie's suggestion, I considered what I actually wanted. I did not want revenge. I wanted consequences strong enough that Daniel could never again tell himself what he'd done was merely a misunderstanding. He received probation. A substantial fine. Mandatory financial counseling. No prison. Some people later asked why I wasn't angrier. I was angry. But anger and destruction are not the same thing. Daniel was still my son. Wanting him accountable did not require wanting his life permanently ruined. That distinction took me months to understand. Brooke filed for divorce 4 months after the hearing. I don't know everything that happened between them. I never asked. Sophie told me her mother repeatedly said she had not signed up to be married to a man under criminal investigation. That sentence told me more than Brooke probably intended. Her townhouse development was eventually sold at a loss to a larger developer. She moved 2 counties away, closer to her mother, and joined a smaller real estate firm. For a long time I was angry with her. Then the anger faded. What remained was mostly sadness. Brooke had mistaken modesty for weakness. Daniel had mistaken love for entitlement. Both mistakes cost them dearly. The company changed too. Foster asked whether I intended to return to active management. No. Board chair? No. Then what do you want? Accountability. Walter and I had made a mistake. We had created financial structures. Trusts. Voting protections. Succession documents. But we had never created a clear family governance system. So with Marjorie and the board, I established one. Any Calloway family member seeking employment, financial benefit or governance authority connected to the trust would be evaluated under written criteria. No automatic jobs. No hidden promises. No assumption that blood created competence. It was not designed to punish Daniel. It was designed to prevent another Daniel. There is a difference. Sophie worried that accepting anything from me afterward would make it appear she'd sided with me for money. When I offered to pay the remainder of her college tuition, she refused. "Grandma, I don't want you thinking I helped because—" "Stop." She stopped. "Loyalty cannot be bought." I took her hand. "It can only be recognized." She eventually accepted. She graduated with a degree in accounting. Later she began working part-time with Marjorie, learning the financial side of the trust. Not because I had promised her control. I hadn't. Not because I intended to replace Daniel with Sophie. I didn't. But because I had finally learned something Walter and I should have understood decades earlier. Secrecy and humility are not the same thing. We had thought hiding our wealth would protect Daniel from entitlement. But we'd hidden the history too. The barn. The contaminated resin. The nights without sleep. The years when one bad invoice could have ended everything. Daniel saw comfort. He never saw its cost. That did not excuse what he did. But I would not repeat the mistake with Sophie. She would know the whole story. My relationship with Daniel did not heal quickly. I don't believe honesty allows me to pretend otherwise. There was no dramatic apology. No Christmas reconciliation. No single conversation that repaired everything. Some things cannot be repaired by saying sorry. They have to be rebuilt through behavior. At first Daniel called once every few weeks. The conversations were careful. Weather. Work. Sophie. Nothing important. Then he started calling on Sundays. Not every Sunday. Then most Sundays. He found a job managing inventory for a small manufacturing supplier in the next county. No executive title. No Calloway name on the building. No mother controlling the board. He applied himself. He got the job himself. And he kept it. That ordinary fact gave me more hope than any apology. 2 years later, we both attended Sophie's graduation. Daniel sat 3 rows behind me. Afterward, in the crowd of families taking photographs, he found me. We stood together watching Sophie laugh with her friends. "She turned out better than either of us deserved credit for," he said. "She turned out exactly like herself." He smiled faintly. "That's the part neither of us gets credit for." We stood in silence. Then Daniel said, "I think about that hearing a lot." I didn't answer. I keep trying to figure out when I became the kind of person who could do that. His voice was quiet. I thought there must have been one moment. He shook his head. "But I can't find it." I looked at him. "I think it was 100 small ones." That was the first thing Daniel had said in 2 years that made me believe he finally understood. That's usually how it happens. He looked at me. "Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to become someone they'd be ashamed of," I said. "They just stop noticing the small steps along the way." Daniel nodded. After a while, he hugged me. Briefly. Awkwardly. The first time he'd done so since before Walter died. "I'll call Sunday." He did. He still does. Most weeks. I still live in the lake house. I still climb the stairs Brooke thought were too dangerous for me. My knees complain now. I complain back. Hollis comes by every few weeks to fish from the dock Walter and I built the summer before Daniel was born. Marjorie and I meet twice a year, though lunch usually lasts longer than the legal work. And some mornings I sit in Walter's old chair beside the window. Coffee in hand. Lake perfectly still. I think about the 19-year-old girl selling raffle tickets at a county fair. The woman working in Alton Pierce's barn. The young wife staring at contaminated resin and wondering whether she'd lose everything. The mother who thought hiding what she'd built would protect her son. And the widow whose son eventually stood before a judge and tried to convince the world she could no longer manage her own life. For 30 years, I had mistaken making myself smaller for humility. I thought silence proved money had not changed me. Sometimes it did. But silence has a cost. Sophie once asked whether I regretted not telling Daniel the truth when he was young. I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. Would knowing have made him grateful? Would it have made him entitled sooner? Would understanding what Walter and I sacrificed have changed him? Or would knowing what he stood to inherit have changed him in another way entirely? I don't know. And age has taught me that some questions do not become easier simply because you have more years in which to ask them. What I do know is this. Daniel did not become the man who tried to take control of his mother's life in a single day. Brooke did not begin by plotting to take an old woman's house. And I did not lose control of my privacy in one dramatic moment. It happened through small permissions. A key. The mail. A password. A question I didn't challenge. Concern I accepted without examining. A boundary I allowed someone else to move because I was grieving and tired and wanted to believe family always meant safety. That is how people sometimes lose enormous things. One small concession at a time. But it is also how they get them back. One document. One phone call. One person willing to tell the truth. One boundary restored. One quiet decision not to surrender the next inch. A few weeks after Daniel's divorce became final, Sophie and I sat on the dock. She asked me, "Grandma, if you could go back, would you do everything differently?" I looked across the lake. No. She seemed surprised. Nothing? Oh, I'd change plenty. I smiled. I'd tell your father more. I'd hide less. I'd create clearer rules around the company. I paused. And I'd probably buy a better car before your grandfather spent 11 years complaining about the transmission. Sophie laughed. Then I became serious. But I wouldn't change the woman who finally walked into that courtroom. Why? Because she stopped asking permission to be as capable as she actually was. Sophie was quiet. Then she rested her head against my shoulder. The sun was going down behind the trees. Walter's dock creaked beneath us. For the first time in a very long while, I did not feel like a widow protecting what remained of her old life. I felt like the same woman who had once stood in a drafty barn explaining chemistry to a man who wasn't sure she belonged there. The same woman who rebuilt a formula when everyone thought the business might fail. The same woman Walter believed in before there was anything impressive to believe in. Sophie is working toward her master's now. She told me that when she has children someday, she does not intend to hide the family's history from them. Not the money. Not the mistakes. Not Daniel. Not me. All of it. I want them to know where things came from, she said. I think that's wise. You didn't do that with Dad. No. Do you regret it? Parts of it. She looked at me. Why only parts? Because people like to believe there's one perfect way to raise a child. I shook my head. There isn't. I had wanted Daniel to become his own man. That was not wrong. I had wanted him to earn his own career. That was not wrong either. But I had confused withholding wealth with withholding truth. Those are different things. I could have told him about the contaminated resin without telling him what the trust was worth. I could have shown him the old ledgers. Taken him to Alton's barn before it was demolished. Told him about Walter crying at 2 in the morning because we might lose everything. Perhaps then he would have understood that Calloway Bonding Systems wasn't a family prize waiting to be distributed. It was 40 years of decisions. Would that have prevented what happened? I don't know. And I refuse to rewrite the past merely to make the present easier to explain. Daniel made his choices. I made mine. Both can be true. There is another truth I learned. People often imagine power looks like expensive clothes. A large house. A title. A driver waiting outside. Walter and I never wanted any of those things. That made us invisible in a way wealth usually does not. Brooke saw my old car and assumed limitation. Daniel saw my quiet retirement and assumed irrelevance. Even people in town who knew our history gradually remembered Walter as the businessman and me as his wife. I allowed that. For years, it amused me. Later, it protected me. And eventually, it endangered me. Because when people underestimate you long enough, sometimes they begin making decisions based on the assumption that you cannot stop them. That was Daniel's greatest mistake. Not that he didn't know about the 61%. Not that he didn't know about the formula. Not even that he didn't know Marjorie had spent 35 years protecting the legal structures Walter and I built. His greatest mistake was believing that age had turned his mother into someone else. It hadn't. Grief had slowed me. Loneliness had made me careless. Love had made me hesitant. But underneath all of that was still the woman who noticed when the numbers didn't add up. I think about Priscilla sometimes. A woman outside a post office mentioning she'd seen Brooke at county records. She had no idea that mattered. Neither did I. I think about Denise, who became frightened and nearly stepped away, then returned through the proper legal process and found the second request that strengthened the case. I think about Foster recognizing me in Marjorie's waiting room. About Hollis sitting on the witness stand in a jacket he probably hadn't worn since his retirement dinner. About a young process server apologizing for handing me papers he had no role in creating. None of these people saved me alone. Most didn't even know they were helping when they first did. They simply told the truth about the small piece they had seen. And in the end, that was enough. Truth rarely arrives as one spectacular revelation. More often it arrives as fragments. A phone number. A timestamp. A signature curved the wrong way. An appointment that never happened. A witness who remembers a kitchen table 40 years later. One fragment means little. Enough fragments become a wall. Walter understood that better than I did. He used to tell me that good manufacturing wasn't about producing one perfect batch. It was about building a process that made bad batches difficult to produce. For years I thought he was talking about adhesives. Now I think he was talking about life without knowing it. After everything with Daniel, I stopped relying on trust where structure should exist. The family governance charter was part of that. So were clearer boundaries around the Ainsley Trust. Sophie knows what authority she does and does not have. Daniel knows too. There will be no whispered assumptions about inheritance. No jobs promised because of a surname. No family member given control merely because someone dies. Love can be generous. Governance should be clear. Those two things are not enemies. Sometimes clarity is what allows love to survive. Daniel once asked me, during one of our Sunday calls, whether he would inherit anything when I died. It was almost a year after the hearing. I appreciated that he asked directly. "What do you think?" I said. "I don't know." "Good." He laughed once, nervously. "I suppose I deserved that." "This isn't about what you deserve." "Then what is it about?" "What happens to the trust will be decided according to what protects the company, the charitable commitments your father and I made, and the people who depend on both." There was silence. "And me?" "You are my son." "That's not what I meant." "I know." Another silence. Then he surprised me. "That's fair." I don't know whether the Daniel of 3 years earlier could have said that. Perhaps consequences teach what parents cannot. The last time Hollis came fishing, he stood at the end of the dock for nearly 3 hours and caught absolutely nothing. Walter would have mocked him mercilessly. When Hollis finally packed up, he looked toward the house. "You ever think about selling?" I laughed. "Don't start." He laughed too. Then he became serious. "Walter would have been proud of you." I looked at the water. "He would have been heartbroken." Both can be true. That sentence stayed with me. Both can be true. I can love my son and still believe what he did was unforgivable at the time he did it. I can forgive him now without pretending it never happened. I can regret keeping secrets without accepting responsibility for his fraud. I can understand Brooke's fear without excusing what she helped create. I can possess wealth without believing it makes me important. I can be old without being helpless. Two truths can sit beside each other. Life becomes easier when you stop demanding that one erase the other. I still keep the forged signature. Not framed. Not displayed. It's in a file in Marjorie's office with the rest of the documents. I looked at it again once, about a year after the case ended. The imitation was good. Very good. Whoever copied it had studied me. But they had studied the appearance of my name, not the movement that created it. That is why the R was wrong. That is why the H had no hook. There is something almost poetic about that now. Daniel and Brooke had done the same thing with me. They studied the appearance. Widow. 66. Old car. Quiet house. Modest clothes. Grieving. Alone. They copied the outline and assumed they understood the person. They didn't. The difference between appearance and truth was small. But sometimes a small difference is enough to bring down an entire case. I used to think the most important thing Walter and I built was Calloway Bonding Systems. I don't anymore. Companies change hands. Money disappears. Buildings are demolished. Even formulas eventually become obsolete. What mattered was learning that a person's right to direct her own life does not become less valuable because she gets older. And love does not require surrendering that right simply because the person asking for it is your child. For most of my life, I never thought I would need to defend that principle. Then I did. And when the moment came, I discovered something I wish more people understood before they need it. Strength does not always feel like strength while you're using it. Sometimes it feels like sitting alone at a kitchen table, frightened, writing down a phone number. Sometimes it feels like not confronting someone when every part of you wants answers. Sometimes it feels like telling your granddaughter you don't know. Sometimes it feels like letting a lie travel all the way into a courtroom because that's the first place it can finally be forced to answer questions. And sometimes strength is simply refusing to sign. The lake looks different in winter now. Walter always preferred summer. I prefer winter. There is less movement. The trees become bare enough that you can see farther. Maybe age does that too. Removes enough leaves that you finally see the shape of things. I see Daniel more clearly now. Not as the little boy he was. Not as the man in the courtroom. As both. I see myself more clearly too. Not as victim. Not as triumphant businesswoman. Both descriptions are too simple. I was a grieving woman who trusted people she loved longer than the evidence justified. Then I corrected course. That's all. Maybe that's enough. On the anniversary of Walter's death this year, Daniel came to the house. He didn't call first. For a second, when I heard the knock, I remembered the old key rattling in the lock. Then I opened the door. He was holding 2 coffees. Peace offering. For what? I don't know yet. I let him in. We sat in Walter's old room. Daniel looked toward the chair. I miss him. It was the first time he'd said that to me. So do I. I was angry at him after he died. I looked at him. Why? For leaving. There was no logic in it. Grief rarely cares about logic. I think I was angry at you too. For what? Still being here. That surprised me. Daniel stared at his coffee. Dad was gone and suddenly everything felt like it was going to change. The house. You. Brooke's project was falling apart. I was getting passed over at work again. He shook his head. I started thinking if I could just control enough things, nothing else would fall apart. And then? I kept needing more control. There it was. Not an excuse. An explanation. I could accept one without mistaking it for the other. You could have asked me for help. I know. I would have helped you. I know that now. You knew it then. Daniel looked at me. Maybe. That answer was more honest than the apology I'd waited years to hear. He continued. But asking meant admitting I had failed. And taking didn't? I didn't call it taking. What did you call it? He gave a tired smile. Helping. I nodded. People can do terrible things once they find a respectable word for them. He looked toward Walter's chair. Yeah. We sat there for a long time. Nothing was fixed. But nothing needed to be fixed that morning. Sometimes the most important progress is simply that 2 people can finally describe the same event using the same words. Before Daniel left, he stopped at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd asked me to downsize 3 days after his father's funeral. He ran his hand over the edge. Is this the table? What table? The formula. I understood. No. That one was in our first apartment. What happened to it? Your father broke one of the legs moving it. Daniel laughed. Of course he did. He claimed the wood was defective. Of course he did. For a moment we were simply mother and son sharing a memory of Walter. Then Daniel said, I wish I'd known those stories. I looked at him. So do I. That was my part. Not the forged signature. Not the petition. Not the bank account. But the silence that came before all of it. I could own that much without owning what wasn't mine. Daniel put on his coat. I'll call Sunday. I know. He did. I still don't know exactly what Daniel and I will become to each other. Maybe there are relationships that never return to what they were. Perhaps they shouldn't. What we had before was built partly on assumptions. What we have now, fragile as it sometimes feels, is built on knowledge. He knows who I am. I know who he is capable of becoming, in both directions. There is less innocence between us. But perhaps more truth. At my age, I will take truth. Sometimes Sophie asks me to tell her the old company stories again. Not the courtroom. The early ones. Alton. The resin truck. Walter selling our first large contract. The time a mixer motor failed on Christmas Eve and 6 of us spent the night repairing it because a shipment had to leave on December 26th. She writes things down. What are you doing? Family history. Nobody wants to read about industrial adhesives. I do. That makes me smile. Perhaps Walter and I were wrong to think the only dangerous inheritance was money. Ignorance can be inherited too. So can silence. Sophie intends to inherit neither. There is one more thing I want to leave you with. For years I believed staying quiet was proof of confidence. If I knew who I was, why did anyone else need to know? There is truth in that. But only up to a point. Because sometimes making yourself smaller does not create humility. It creates space for someone else to define you. And if you remain silent long enough, they may begin believing their definition more than your reality. Daniel saw an aging widow. Brooke saw unused assets. Craig Willoughby saw a legal procedure. The bank saw an account. The court saw a petition. Each view contained a fragment of truth. None contained me. I was still the machinist's daughter. Still the girl at the county fair. Still the woman reading chemistry journals at the library. Still the wife sitting with Walter at 2 in the morning. Still the person who caught a formula error nobody else noticed. Still the mother who loved her son. Still the grandmother Sophie trusted. Still the controlling shareholder of a company most people thought I'd sold decades ago. Still Ruth. Age had not erased any of those women. It had accumulated them. A few months ago Sophie and I sat at the end of the dock at sunset. She asked, "Grandma, if you could go back, would you do everything differently?" No. She looked surprised. Nothing? I'd change plenty. Like what? I'd tell your father more. She nodded. I'd hide less. Another nod. I'd establish clear rules around the company before anyone had a reason to misunderstand them. What else? I'd buy a better car before Walter spent 11 years complaining about the transmission. She laughed. Then I became serious. But I wouldn't change the woman who walked into that courtroom. Why? Because she finally stopped asking permission to be as capable as she actually was. Sophie was quiet. Then she rested her head against my shoulder. The sun dropped behind the trees. Walter's dock creaked beneath us. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like a widow protecting what remained of her old life. I felt like the same woman who once stood in a drafty barn explaining chemistry to a man who wasn't sure she belonged there. The same woman who rebuilt a formula when everyone thought the business might fail. The same woman Walter believed in before there was anything impressive to believe in. I had spent decades allowing the world to underestimate me because I thought there was dignity in not correcting it. Sometimes there was. But there comes a point when making yourself smaller no longer serves humility. It serves the people who benefit from believing you are small. Daniel learned that in a courtroom. I learned it much later than I should have. And Sophie, I hope, will never have to learn it the hard way. Because the truth was never that I secretly controlled 61% of a company. That was only money. The truth was that I had spent most of my life knowing exactly who I was. For a few months after Walter died, grief made me forget something important. Not my appointments. Not my bank account. Not where I had put my keys. I forgot that I did not need my son's permission to remain the woman I had always been. And once I remembered that, there was very little left for anyone else to take from me.